Right, hello. I'm doing my best impression of a YouTube influencer, so I suppose I should have started by going, "Hey guys." No, in all seriousness, I'm recording this, even though it makes me a bit nervous because obviously I've had to cancel the Thursday period 6, which I'm sure you're all gutted about because of Year 11 Parents' Evening. And I'm fully aware of the fact that I missed both of your lessons last week. Candidly, I really wasn't very well, and I really, really appreciate your patience with that. So what this basically is a pre-record of me talking you through the last sort of little bits of the people's budget that I know we didn't get through the last lesson that I had you. I know that you got set some work from Mrs. Pugh to sort of consolidate your understanding of the Lord's crisis and the people's budget and moving on to the 1911 Parliament Act. But I thought I'd do this just so you could sort of fill in that A3 sheet that I handed out last time and sort of consolidate your notes. So I'll start by sort of recapping what we are focusing on and what I'm going to recap with you. So in terms of the justification behind the people's budget, then we have a significant need for increased taxation. Society by 1909 had a lot of extra demands on it in terms of finances and the economy. So we've got imperialism, the budding sort of arms race with Germany, a need to spend money on the navy, but also the pressures of new liberalism and Lloyd George's desires to fund the pensions without sort of having a contributory aspect. And in order to do that, you need to raise taxes. So Lloyd George estimates that the British government is in like a debt or a shortfall of about 16 to 17 million pounds. That is what the people's budget is supposed to be addressing. So, as we remember, the House of Lords is basically dominated by the Conservative Party. It's a lot of men with landed wealth and aristocratic titles. It's mostly a hereditary House of Lords at this point, and this is a real problem for the Liberals because the House of Lords keeps throwing out Liberal legislation. So there's a couple of things on education, licensing and plural voting that the House of Lords either gives these sort of wrecking amendments to. So say, for example, saying, oh, yes, okay, you can have pensions, but everybody has to pay the same base rate of income tax at 67% of their income. That is, in theory, allowing the bill to pass, but it's a wrecking amendment because obviously the Liberals aren't going to do that. So Balfour, who is still the leader of the Conservative Party, is using the House of Lords and using the Conservative dominance in the House of Lords to really frustrate Liberal policy. And the sort of motivation behind this is to lead the radicals in the Liberal Party and lead the Labour Party to split. So they're basically trying to recreate the 1886 split of the Labour Party over Home Rule. So, obviously, we see the little lovely eyebrow devil for Lloyd George, but basically this is the two interpretations of Lloyd George. Was he this humanitarian person trying to push legislation through the House of Lords because he really cared about the plight of your average Joe, and this just happened to present him with an opportunity to challenge the House of Lords? Or was he opportunistic and self-motivated, and the people's budget was specifically designed to pick a fight with the House of Lords? So this is the kind of interpretations that I want you to have in your mind as we move through. So terms of the people's budget, builds on Asquith's foundations. It's not completely new. This idea of a non-contributory pension is not completely new. Asquith's doing this when he's the Chancellor under Campbell Bannerman. Lloyd George obviously becomes the Chancellor when Asquith becomes Prime Minister in 1908. I'm not going to recap this in a huge amount of detail because I know that we've done it to death. Right, what I want to bring your attention to is this last little bit here. So this is what Lloyd George refers to the people's budget as. He says, this is a war budget. It's for raising money to wage implacable warfare against poverty and squalidness. So he's being really clever here because a lot of people are campaigning for, obviously, an increased investment in the military and dreadnoughts. And he's saying that actually the war that we need to fight and the war that's the most important that we fight is not the war against, or not the possible war against Germany. It's the war against poverty. It's the war against these sort of big roadblocks in people's lives. Poverty, starvation, lack of education. I cannot help hoping and believing that before this generation has passed away, we shall have advanced a great step towards that good time, when poverty and the wretchedness and human degradation which always follows in its camp will be as remote to the people of this country as the wolves which once infested its forests. So obviously wolves don't exist in the UK anymore. I know that people are trying to bring them back to Scotland, which I suppose would be a good idea. But he's basically saying that we need to make poverty a thing of the past. And the way that you make poverty a thing of the past is by implementing social reform. And the way you pay for that social reform is with super taxation. So politically, the attitudes towards taxation have been changing. So because of the increased amount of government expenditure, both parties, both the Conservatives and the Liberals, are moving towards direct taxation. So remember, indirect taxation is taxing consumption, so taxing food, alcohol, tobacco, that kind of stuff. Direct taxation is taxing someone's income. Now, direct taxation is appealing because it's a reliable source of income, and means that you can tax someone based off their capacity to pay it. So if you're taxing consumption, everybody's hit by the same tax, because if you've got like a 20% tax on alcohol, whether you're earning 50p a day or £50,000 a day, you're paying the same rate of tax. Whereas direct taxation, you can graduate it. So you can have the person on 50p a day paying 10% of their income, and you can have the person on £50,000 a day paying 45% of their income. So instead of having sort of like a blanket indirect taxation, you can move towards direct taxation that is graduated. And people who can afford to pay more will pay more. So this super tax that Asquith suggests and Lloyd George tries to implement is an example of direct taxation. It's taxing people on their income. So Lloyd George's budget is not completely new. There have been sort of seeds laid already about this idea of moving towards a direct taxation model and moving towards a graduated taxation based off what you can afford to pay. So what I'd like you to do, pause this here, have a go at answering this question for me. So how have political attitudes towards taxation changed? So you're thinking about, we've moved away from this focus on indirect taxation, taxing consumption, towards directly taxing people's income. If you want to push yourself, start thinking about why that motivation might have arrived and why people's attitudes towards taxation have changed. So have a pause, answer that in a couple of sentences for me. So 3 potential political motivations behind the budget then. Meet the budgetary deficit, obviously. Britain's in a huge amount of debt, and that debt's going to get worse if we implement pensions and we pay for that using like taxation revenue and we don't reform the tax system. We've also got the need to sort of maintain morale, both amongst the electorate, but also within the Liberal Party itself. And finally, the Liberals are still trying to maintain their commitment to free trade. So, obviously, we've got falling tax revenues because we're going through a trade depression. Less stuff is being sold, we've got less trade, which means the government is receiving less taxation. Also, if you've got a depression and people are and people aren't bringing in enough money, they're not going to be purchasing anything. So that indirect taxation on consumption is not going to help, because if you have less people buying stuff, the government isn't going to have enough money. So if we want to spend 8 million on pensions and 3 million on the Navy and dreadnoughts, we need to reform the tax system. And obviously doing that is going to require a move to direct taxation. So one of the motivations is to meet the budgetary deficit. Second motivation is to basically sort out morale. So the Liberal bills keep getting defeated in the House of Lords. These bills on plural voting in education and licensing, they're getting kicked out of the House of Lords. We've also got some significant by-election losses to the Labour Party. So the People's Budget is an attempt, possibly by Lloyd George, to sort of bring the electorate back on side, but also to prevent a party split, to prevent the radicals in the Liberal Party defecting to the Labour Party. So we're coming back to that phrase that Lloyd George has used before, and the phrase that Lloyd George used when he was trying to push forward the pensions. He's really using this to try and stop the electoral rot. So he is not just doing this for humanitarian reasons. There is a deep political motivation running through this. No, we won't do that here. So finally, we've got pressure to deal with the issue of poverty. Now, Chamberlain suggests that tariff reform is the only way to deal with poverty, because tariff reform would raise revenue through tariffs, through taxes on imports and exports, and that tax revenue can then be used for social reform without raising taxes for ordinary people. So the Conservatives are accusing the Liberals of not being able to fund the reform because they're not committing to tariff reform. However, Lloyd George says, well, actually, through this shift to direct taxation and through these super taxes and through these taxes on things like tobacco and alcohol and petrol and cars, we can still maintain our commitment to free trade. We can still be competitive in the international trade market, but we can also pay for our reforms in our navy, because that money is coming from direct taxation from those in society who can afford to pay it. So, political impact of the budget then. 1906 to 1908, like I said, the sort of euphoria of the Liberal victory has worn off, and the Liberals are losing by-elections to the Labour Party. So Keir Hardie, here we have him looking miserable. He doesn't look miserable, he just looks very sad. He's got proper puppy dog eyes, doesn't he? Anyway, so Keir Hardie attacked the government over unemployment, and the by-elections of 1907 really contribute to the Liberal Party sort of losing its grip very slightly on the country, because the Labour Party are looking much more appealing. So Lloyd George in July and October 1909, after the rejection of the budget, is openly attacking the peers, and he's using quite evocative, bombastic language when he does this. A fully equipped Duke costs as much to keep as 2 dreadnoughts, and they are just as great a terror, and they last longer. And they, the House of Lords, are forcing a revolution, and they will get it. Who made 10,000 men the owners of the soil, and the rest of us trespassers in the land of our birth? So both of these quotations from Lloyd George's speeches actually provide us quite good ammunition for the argument that, well, actually, Lloyd George is not introducing the budget for purely humanitarian perspectives. He's doing it to pick a fight with the House of Lords and to force the House of Lords, reform for the House of Lords through. So the budget is obviously rejected, 350 votes to 75. And Lloyd George is crowing, we got them at last. Again, motivation behind the argument that he's doing it deliberately to annoy the House of Lords. So the Liberals obviously now have complete legitimacy to go after the House of Lords, because they've rejected a parliamentary budget, which really there's not much precedent for. So the Liberals call a general election in January 1910, which is basically a referendum on the budget. So the Liberals run this election campaign basically saying, vote for us if you support the budget. And if the Liberals win, the Conservatives are obviously going to have to back down, because the electorate, the ordinary British public, have said, we have voted for the Liberals because we support this budget. So the Liberals' success at this election has significant implications for the other parties. The Liberals win in 1910, but it is not as much of a landslide as 1906. So the Conservatives do regain a couple of the votes that they lost in 1906. However, they do still lose. They do not form a government. And so the Lords have to reluctantly swallow the budget. So the Liberals here have won. So, unfortunately for the Conservatives, the Liberal win of the January 1910 election sort of sends them into disarray. We've got sort of disputes between the protectionists, people who are committed to tariff reform, but we've also got disputes between people who actually might be seeing the benefits of free trade. So there's a lot of disputes within the Conservative Party, and they're looking quite disjointed and chaotic under Balfour's leadership. On the flip side, we've also got the Labour Party being trapped. So Ramsay MacDonald, who is the secretary of the Labour Party, supported taxation on wealth, and they supported the attack on the House of Lords. So now that, the Liberal Party have achieved this, the Labour Party begin to get a little bit stuck, because the Liberals are doing what the Labour Party could offer. So there's not really any danger of the Labour Party growing or outflanking the Liberals. And this is significant because by 1910, we don't really see any significant Labour victories in the by-elections. So again, I'd like you to have a pause. I want you to think about these two questions for me. So what's the significance of the 1910 general election as a referendum on the budget? So how did the electoral results impact various political parties? And then discuss the challenges and successes faced by the Conservatives and the Labour Party in response to the political fallout from the 1909 budget. Okay, so Lloyd George and his political ambition. So, autumn 1909, after the Lords have rejected the budget, he spends a lot of time attacking the Tory peers, attacking the House of Lords, and less time defending the details of his budget. So again, motivation behind the idea that Lloyd George has done this deliberately to antagonise the House of Lords. So, this budget becomes, for Lloyd George, basically a means of achieving his lasting victory of the Lords. Even though, yes, there's a second election that's required in December 1910, the election victory in January 1910 suggests that the electorate are committed to Lloyd George and his social reform. They're committed to the people's budget. They're committed to this super tax on the super wealthy. So the December 1910 election is called basically because what the Liberals want to do is create Liberal peers. They want to create Liberal peers sitting in the House of Lords. And the King refuses to do this unless Asquith wins another election. So the January 1910 election is basically a referendum on the people's budget, and the December 1910 election is basically an election that provides legitimacy for the creation of Liberal peers in the House of Lords. The Liberals win. So the December election provides basically identical result to the January election. So Asquith brings in something called the Parliament Bill. This removes the peers' veto over financial legislation. So the House of Lords can no longer outright veto anything to do with finances, and it restricts their veto on ordinary legislation. So this absolute veto power that the House of Lords has previously had is significantly restricted. So, have a think about this question for me. So what is the significance of the Parliament Act in addressing the House of Lords? So why is the Parliament Act significant? What does it allow the House of Commons to do? How does it restrict the powers of the House of Lords? So how has the balance of power changed between the Commons and the Lords? What can the Lords no longer do? Answer that in a couple of sentences for me. So, political, financial and social consequences then. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Irish and a little bit about sort of taxation moving forwards, even up until like Thatcher's government. So, Home Rule, impact on the Conservative Party, impact on the life of Parliament, which basically means how long Parliament sits for, and then the impact of the 1915 election. So, Home Rule is immediately restored to the top of the parliamentary agenda because nationalist MPs, so Irish nationalist MPs, can now argue that actually the passage of Home Rule is feasible for the first time. And this is feasible because the influence and the power of the House of Lords has been restricted. So remember, we've got these Conservatives who are sort of previously known as the Unionists, and they are sort of vehemently committed to keeping the Union together. And the fact that now the House of Lords' power is restricted, this means that nationalist MPs might have more of a chance of getting Home Rule for the Irish. Now, the impact on the Conservative Party is quite significant. The right wing of the party, or the right wing of the party in the House of Lords, believe that the Lords actually should have rejected the Parliament Bill and defied the King. So we've got quite extreme radicalism on the right-hand side of the party who are basically going, no, we should not have passed this Parliament Bill. We should have defied the King. This should never have happened. And the sort of radicals in the right wing of the Conservative Party are blaming the moderates, and in particular, they're blaming Balfour, to the point where in 1911, after the passage of the Parliament Act, Balfour is forced to resign. So Balfour's resignation comes because he is seen as sort of like a traitor, and he's humiliated by accepting and not defying the right wing of the party. Another consequence is the Parliament Act actually reduces the amount of time that Parliament sits for. So previously Parliament would sit for 7 years. Now Parliament sits for 5. This means that after the December 1910 election, Asquith's government would come to the end of its life by December 1915 at the latest. So that is the latest time that Asquith would be able to call the next election. Obviously, by December 1915, we're at war. So this is a particularly difficult stage in the First World War. We're not doing particularly well. We've dug in, stalemate. The Western Front's moved, a couple of millimetres by now. So because we'll look at this in more detail when we get to sort of the impact of the First World War. But basically, Asquith opts to replace his government with a 3-party coalition in May 1915 instead of sort of fighting a traditional general election. Now, by 1914, the rate of income tax has been pushed up. So the standard rate is now 1 shilling and 4 pence. By the end of the First World War, it now stands at 6 shillings. 1920s to 1930s, income tax is then reduced to 4 shillings, despite enormous political pressure. You can imagine we've got the impact of the Great Depression, Wall Street crash. So the government reduces income tax there, which is an interesting move. Basically, what you need to take from this is that governments moved towards heavily relying on direct income tax. So even the government of Thatcher in the 1970s and late 1970s, 1980s, only reduces income tax to a modest 25p, which is a historically incredibly high rate. So after the People's Budget, sort of after the First World War, we really see the government relying heavily on income tax and direct taxation. And obviously that's not changed. Today's government is still heavily reliant on direct taxation. Now, the only aspect of the 1909 budget that really fails to survive is Lloyd George's land tax. So land valuation, which is a massively laborious task, takes ages, goes ahead up until 1914, but during the war, that's obviously not feasible. And even though Lloyd George is Prime Minister until 1922, he's too dependent on his colleagues in the Conservative Party to bring the land taxes back. Obviously, because the land taxes are going to hit the Conservatives the most, because oftentimes they are the landed gentry, they have a lot of landed wealth, and he needs to appease them for various reasons that we'll look at in more detail when we get to the First World War and its consequences. By 1920, they've been abandoned. So, what I'd like you to do finally, I want you to explore the long-term and the immediate consequences of the Parliament Act. So how does it impact the political agenda? How does it impact calls for home rule? How does it impact income tax and the way that the government approaches taxation long-term? Thank you for listening. I know it's not ideal to have me lecture at you for ages. Obviously, the more ideal situation would be we'd have a conventional lesson, but obviously because of parents leaving, that's not possible. I will see you on Monday. What's the date on Monday? Monday the 4th of December. We'll do a little bit of a wrap-up of the Parliament Act, and then we're going to move on to looking at women's suffrage. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you on Monday.